My name is Guillermo Kerber. I am originally from Uruguay. I'm working at the World Council of Churches. Now I'm responsible for the project on human rights to enhance human dignity and the project on climate change and water. I have focused my work in the WCC, and this is in relationship to our identity as Christian, as church organization, on what has been developed in international law as victims' rights. Focusing now on victims' rights, you bring the other part of the story to see. There's a very strong relationship to what you are and what are the core values of your life. And I think as Christian, the concern for human dignity, to realize that men and women are created as image of God, and this is the teaching from the Genesis, and the life, the message, death and resurrection of Jesus are a way to, as John put it in the Gospel, to bring life in all its abundance to the people. And when you look at the different situations that we can call now human rights violations, these are attempts to deny the human dignity of the people. So I think the motivation to work on human rights issues is, I would say, is at the core of the mission of the church. And all human beings, all Christians, should have this as part of their life commitment. Coming from Uruguay, where we experienced for 11-year dictatorship, and where a lot of human rights were violated, while I was living there, and this was while I was in my teens, I would say, and I was at that point working very much in relationship to the church. And I realized that my commitment as Christian should be in defense of, at that time I would not call it human rights, but in defense of human dignity, from this Christian perspective. And this, afterwards, it was translated into human rights defense or human rights promotions and protection. One of the most important experiences for me was to attend one of the hearing sessions of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Peru. And at this hearing, it was not in the capital city, but it was in Ayacucho, a small village quite far from the capital city in Peru. It's quite interesting because Ayacucho in indigenous language means the place of the dead. And there you saw, and I saw because I was attending these hearings, people who were coming to share their testimonies. Their testimonies of human rights violations, of rapes, of watching their relatives being killed, being tortured. But as they were telling their stories, it was the first time they were listened, it was the first time they were believed on what they were saying. So in the same process of telling their stories, they were somehow restoring their human dignity. And there was a physical change, I would say, because they started like this, and as they started with their testimony, they stood up, and they were facing something, a public of about 200, 300 people, but they knew that this was sent by TV to the whole country. So the whole country was aware of what they have experienced and what they were asking. And for me it was also very interesting that what they were asking was not mainly economic compensation or important issues, but very basic recognition on their human rights. The right for their children to go to school, the right to have a health service, the right to work, and so on. So I think for me this was one of the most important experiences that in a very visual way showed me on one hand the consequences on human rights violations, because you saw how the people have suffered. On the other hand, how can you reconcile a society that has suffered? I think the core values of the gospel are the basics for human rights protection and promotion. I don't think the church should change its discourse to a human rights or international law discourse, but by deepening the theological and ethical contents of, let's take some, for example, love to the neighbor, solidarity, take care of the poor in the Old Testament perspective, the care for the widow, the stranger, the orphan. This allows to see, well, what are the rights of the people. The Old Testament in particular show the concern of God for its people, and especially for those who are what we should call now most vulnerable in the society. In human rights terminology, this is looking for the rights of the people who are excluded, who do not have the means to access health, work, education, basic human rights. So I think the role of the church is to deepen the message of Jesus, deepen its ethical and theological components to somehow root the human rights work in this long tradition of the church that still can have a particular input in the human rights struggle. Let me give you an example also to show what are the challenges many times you face when you're dealing with human rights violations. I had the opportunity to follow up the process after the war in Sierra Leone. So we organized with the churches and with a very strong interreligious council in Sierra Leone a series of workshops in the provinces to address the consequences of the war. And one of the challenges that we were able to witness was that in the same village you had the victim and the perpetrator living as neighbors. So how to rebuild confidence, trust when gross human rights violations have been committed, when there is no prosecution to the perpetrators. And here is where I think there's a specific contribution. Churches, and in some cases like in Sierra Leone, other religious organizations can make. Because we realize that in order to overcome this resentment and hate in many cases, it was crucial not only to address the victim concerns and the perpetrator concerns, but also to involve the whole community in the process. If you want to have a healing process The whole community should be involved. And here, pastors, priests, or imams in the case of Muslim, because in Sierra Leone you have almost half and half Muslim and Christian population, can play a key role to bring the community together, to have symbols, actions that can show how to turn the page, recognize what were the wrongs then, what can be the ways to overcome them, and bring the community together again.